Job centre staff are being ordered not to record how many people they're sending to food banks. The policy was disclosed when operational instructions sent to thousands of staff up and down the country were revealed. RTUK's Shadia Edwards-Dashti has the details.
There's been speculation that the Department for Work and Pensions is trying to keep the extent of the food bank crisis under wraps here. The guidance released by the department and obtained by a Freedom of Information request submitted back in February was first revealed in a blog called the Universal Credit Sufferer. It showed that job centre staff were being told not to record the amount of people that they were putting forward to food banks. In instructions, they specifically say the signposting slip must not be referred to as a food bank voucher. It goes on to read, the only time job centre staff are allowed to keep track is if the food banks make a request. Now, the revelation does indicate that charities are supporting the benefit system, but not to what extent. And food banks up and down the country, they will only serve clients that provide this voucher and not the signpost. However, due to recent demand, the two are now being treated as the same. Critics say, though, that the data black hole is really allowing ministers to push benefits cuts, which clearly is pushing people into poverty. The Department for Work and Pensions say, though, that research is constantly being modified.
We are constantly reviewing research carried out by organizations to add to our understanding of food banks, and will consider further research to add to our evidence base to ensure we're providing the best possible support for vulnerable groups.
The largest food bank provider in the country, the Trussell Trust, does provide data on all of the people it helps. According to the charity, which is a 400-strong network, it handed out 1.3 million food parcels last year. That's up 13% on the previous year. 60,000 food parcels, or around 5% of its output, were given in 2016 as a direct result of job centre signposting. Meanwhile, just last week, ministers were secretly conjuring up a plan to investigate the government's own policies on the extent of food bank use in the country.
For more on all this, I'm now joined by the author of FoodBankBritain, Barron Woolford. Ray, thank you so much for joining us on RT UK this evening. Why would the government deliberately not keep track of the numbers of people using food banks?
Well, we've had this really sort of strange turnaround with the government over the past few years. When food banks originally started sort of hitting the news agenda, the government position was it was part of the big society and we were all great neighbours, you know, looking out for those in crisis. But the figures have become so enormous, and every group is now saying this is a direct impact of government policy, that the whole issue around food poverty has become politicised and is very toxic for the Tory brand. And we hear about the hostility of refugees, of people from different countries, when really what we should be talking about is the hostility of the poor, the disabled, which is happening now on the streets. People are dying. It's almost like a virus, poverty in the UK at the moment. People have it. They're too embarrassed, too ashamed to tell their own families that they're in poverty or even using a food bank. And people are dying. Every week you'll get a figure, statistic of somebody on the street, homeless, dying, people in poverty dying, and people now with malnutrition and rickets and all sorts of things are going on, which is the direct impact of the government's failure to monitor these policies properly.
There are those who argue that this was that austerity, that is, was a necessity. It was a necessary step to balance budgets and to kind of fix the economic melee that was going on following the economic crisis. I mean, what's your response to that?
Well, what we actually have is that every government department is in crisis or chaos by anybody, media group that you look at. We have a situation in our country at the moment where we have millions. We just talked about the Trussell Trust. That's just one organisation. When you include the Salvation Army and all the independent food banks, there's thousands and thousands. There's over 2 million people sanctioned last year. That's 2 million people that went on average 13 weeks without money. You have the new universal credit being rolled out across the UK. That means huge numbers of people are going 5 weeks without any money whatsoever. We have a crisis in food banks during school holidays where the government accepts that people are hungry and deserve feeding during the school term time, but in the school holidays the government says, oh, we need to spend £280,000 investigating welfare impact with food banks, and at the same time children are going without school placements during the holiday and they are starving the holidays, and food banks are running out of food during school holidays because of the extra demand. And these aren't people that are sitting at home 20 fags a day in a 60-inch screen. Many of these people are holding 2 or 3 jobs. They're working every hour God sends, and they're in poverty. And it's something that is not, it's aspirational, it's something we don't like talking about. And it really is a scandal in the 6th richest economy in the world that people are using food banks. And the government's Department of Works, it says Department of Works, it clearly does not work. And the biggest problem is you would think that a government's department dealing with the vulnerable, the disabled, the elderly, would have some empathy with them. Instead, it's criminalise them. We have ministers coming on TV who say, oh, well, we only have food banks because the government is now highlighting it through their job centre programme, or it's to help people short-term cash flow problems. The reality is that ministers need to visit their local food bank. They need to speak to people, not spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on a report. Go to their library, if there's still one that's not been cut. Go to their local bus stop, or go to the pub, or speak to somebody in the local park, and they will all tell you that they will have a story about what's happening in FoodBankBritain now.
What do you think of ministers launching a study to find out whether their own austerity policies are behind the rise in the use of food banks?
I think it's really offensive to spend £280,000 on a food bank. We have in London, we have an amazing organisation called Street Kitchen in London, which goes around and feeds hungry people on the streets. It's now expanded, it's all over the UK now. And that's not just feeding homeless people, it's actually feeding people who can't afford to cook and eat for themselves. And it really should be that a government should know what the impact of its policies are, and the key aspect of that should be the job centre. The job centre should be monitoring all those people that are saying, look, we've got nothing to eat, and that feedback should be going to the ministers, and they should know exactly what the impact of their policy is. They don't need to spend money on that, they can just ask their frontline staff.
Ray, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thank you. Just one final thing, where can people find your book?
FoodBankBritain, just on internet. It's
Amazon and all of that.
Supports my work as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You.